Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be creating a watercolour pine forest landscape painting. I created this painting from my own reference photo, which you can find the link to down below in the description. You will also be able to find outlines for either printing straight onto watercolour paper or for tracing. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment letting me know what you thought of the video today. And aside from that, let's jump straight in and create this watercolour landscape piece. So first of all, we're going to want to create the really light background colours. To make these really light, we're going to need a lot of water added to each colour that we create. So first of all, I created a really light blue. As you can see, I've added a lot of water to this in comparison to the paint proportion. I also created a lime green, so I used an earthy green and mixed a little bit of yellow into this, and then created a light grey. And to do this, I mixed some black with a little bit of blue and added lots of water so that it wasn't black and it did create that grey shade. You can also see some swatches that I've created. This was to just show how light these are, but you'll see this in a second when I add it down onto paper. To create the backgrounds, I used the wet in wet method, and what this means is for the whole sky area I added a light layer of water down. You don't want to add too much as the paint will all collect into one section. This is not very good as it becomes very messy, and you can tell when it does dry that there was too much water on the paper due to where everything does collect. Then I went in with all of my colours. I started with the light blue at the top of the page. You can barely see it with how light it is, but I added a gentle wash of that with back and forth motions, just dotted this in, then blended it out slightly using a little bit of water, as this then goes into white negative space where we won't be adding any paint. And then below this I added that really light grey. This was really important, again blended it into that white negative space so everything blends very nicely, but you can still see that transition of colour. And I also added a little bit of that lime green, mainly towards the left of that grey section, just because that was how it looked in the reference photo. It did have a little bit of that green yellow element, and I think this is to do with the reflections from the trees and the ground, as they do all have similar colour properties, and this is often reflected with that natural light, so I wanted to get a little bit of that in there. You may also notice as well, I've added a few little lines with that grey, all of which are pointing towards the sun, and this is because the natural sun rays create that sort of stripy effect, so I wanted to get a little bit of that in there with the watercolour, and this is going to become really prominent throughout the whole painting. All of the shadows that we will be adding all reflects from the sun and naturally comes out from that, so the sun is definitely the focal point for today's painting. This is just important to know, as like I say, everything will come together and really reflect that later on. So as you can see, once I'd finished the sky background, I then moved on to creating the ground, and to do this I mixed a yellow with a hint of orange in there so it wasn't as bright, created more of like a mucky orange with a little bit of brown to do that, and then a brown that was still very warm. So all of these colours are very similar but completely different, and I used this to add bits of paint where I knew the ground was going to go and where the really warm elements were from the reference photo. As you can see, everything is still very cohesive even just with that background. There's a lot of brown that moves towards the sunlight, and that is still very reflective throughout all of this background, and you'll see this again further developed when we add the shadows in later. And once you're happy with that quick background, we can move on to adding in the trees, and to do this I created a really dark brown. I used black and just a little bit of brown for this actually, as I wanted it to be as dark as possible, and I would say this is actually the hardest part of the painting, mainly because you have to have really good control to get all of these tree branches in. I'm working on A4 A4 paper and creating them straight lines all the way down was something I personally really struggled with, but I persevered and neatened everything up once I'd got them lines in. So I made them a little bit neater, a little bit straighter where possible. But if you can push through this element, it's going to really start to tie everything together. And as I moved across the page, I moved from right to left. This is something that again is really quite important for creating these trees. If you are left-handed like me, do it in the same direction, and if not the opposite, move from right to left. And I did this to prevent any smudging, as if you've got everything drying the opposite side of where your hand is, you can rest your hand, and this sometimes makes it easier to get them straight lines in. You've got a little bit more control of what you're doing with the paint. And once I got a bit closer to the sun as well, you'll notice I lightened the tree branches a little bit. So to do this, I added a bit of brown and then cleaned the brush and blended this out with some water. So I still connected the branches but left a little bit of a lighter area for where I knew the sun was going to be. And this again is just to show them shadows, the light to dark, and where that sun is, and it's really going to help make it pop a bit more, and it just draws your eye to that lighter section. I also didn't follow my reference photo exactly. You may notice some of my tree branches are slightly different to the outline that I created, and I did try to follow this as best as I could, but I was also very conscious I didn't want it to look perfect. I would encourage you to try developing your own style. You don't want everything to look the exact same, so have that freedom. Don't feel like you're confined to that reference and that traced outline. Also with the trees, some of them you may notice go down to the bottom of the page. These are the ones that are closer to the camera from where the photo was taken, and some will be further back, and the ones that are the furthest back come down to the horizon line, and then you've got the fall in between that come a little bit further down but not completely to the bottom of the page. This is all to do with perspective. Like I say, everything that's further forward will come down more, anything that's further back will be further away. This is a really good thing to note, as if you've never taken perspective into consideration, this just opens your eyes a little bit to how things change and why things look slightly different to what you maybe would expect. It's easy to anticipate all the trees coming down to the same point, but this just brings everything to how it actually looks. It gives it a little bit more dimension. I also created a lighter version of this brown, so I watered it down a little bit and actually added a little bit of grey, so it blended slightly into the background. And I use this for them trees that you can see that are really far away, and again all of this different light and shadow, it's really going to help you to identify that these are trees. So them ones that are further back, it really helps it look like it's in the distance and gives it more of that misty, whimsical feel. So at this stage it is now going back in and adding all these trees, tidying everything up, so if there's anything you've missed from the outlines you can add this in, and it means you're not going to be able to see that outline as well, so I would recommend taking the time to do this. I made sure the outline was slightly darker than usual, so once you have the background you could still see the outline to put the trees in, but now at this point you're going to want to take all of them outlines away. Take your time getting all of that in there. Could mix it up a little bit as well. If you're wanting to try different angles, you could point some trees facing a different direction, maybe a bit more slanted, anything like that. Please feel free to experiment at this stage. And then once you're really happy with this, you can go into adding all of the shadows for the trees. And as I've mentioned before, everything is still coming out from that center point, which is the sun. So all of these lines that I'll be putting in will be accommodating to that. So I went in with the dark brown to start with, and I put this coming out of all of the really dark trees and angled it so it was coming away from the sun, as if the sun was casting these shadows. Then cleaned my brush and blended this out with some water. So you add a really harsh line with the brown and then you blend it out so it looks like it is part of all of that yellow background that we have. So it is just blending everything together as best you can while still creating the really obvious shadows. And then once I've got the really dark lines in, I went in with that lighter grey that we used for them trees that are further back, and I did the same for the shadows coming out of there. So the darks and lights are still very much in line with each other, as in the lighter trees have that lighter shadow and then the darker trees have that darker shadow. I also added some sun rays with the darker grey, same as we did for the background before. I just wanted to darken them up a little bit. So like I say, tidying everything up. If I've missed any yellow, I made sure to add all of that back in. And once you are absolutely sure that you are happy with all of this, you can then mix the colours that you're going to be using for the trees. So I created a nice earthy green and added some brown to it because I didn't want it really light, as this is a very dark painting in terms of the trees. They're all very dark and you want the leaves to align with that. You don't want like bright green going into this now, as it will stand out a little bit too much. It won't fit with how this painting looks so far. So making this quite dark, and then I used a flat brush, added a tiny little bit onto the paintbrush, so much so that I actually dotted some in the palette next to me, just so there wasn't that much paint on the brush, and I used this just to dot it angled face down onto the paper to create the leaf-like structure for the pine. I then used the dark brown that we used for the trees and put this the exact same way that I did with that green over the top. Not completely over the top, you still want some of that green creeping through, but having these dark colours that match up to the trees is going to help blend that into the branches. I also added a little bit of that lime green that we mixed at the start for the background. Just wanted a little bit more green creeping through, but I really didn't add a lot of this, as like I say, you want everything to be very dark and coinciding with the painting so far. And also, you don't want to overdo this. Be careful not to add too much of this watercolour paint down, as it will take away from the leaf-like texture that we're wanting, as if you cover all of that section it will all just blend together. You're not going to have any of that background creeping through. Less is more. Don't overdo this. It's very easy to just keep going and layering colour, but you still want to be able to see the background, as realistically when you look at trees you can still see through to the sky. You can see whatever is behind it, which is what we want to replicate for this painting. And then to finish, I went in with some white acrylic paint to paint in the sun, and I made sure my brush was clean for this. I actually didn't put any water onto this, as I wanted it to really stand out. You can see that it is creeping through the trees just a little bit. I was really happy with how this looked, and as you can see, everything is centering around that. So that white circle is making everything stand to attention. Everything is focused around that. There we have it. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys, and I really hope you've enjoyed creating this watercolour forest pine painting with me. For more nature art themed content, make sure you check out my Patreon down below in the description. I upload weekly real-time nature art themed tutorials. You can also find more nature art tutorials over on my channel, where you can learn how to use watercolour and coloured pencil to create a variety of different art pieces. Let me know how you found this video down below in the comments, and I hope to see you all next time. Bye guys!